Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtuous Woman Show. My name is Sheila Juma and I'm so excited to be hosting you this very wonderful Sunday evening. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you're having a great 2024. If you can, please let us know how your year has been so far. Like I said, my name is Sheila Juma and today we are having a very interesting show. But before we get into it, like always, I'd like to ask you to go ahead and follow us on our social media platforms. We are the Virtuous Woman Show across the board. That means Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. If you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, there's quite a bit of content on there for you. You will have a great time watching and being blessed by the great content that is already on the channel. So subscribe so you don't miss anything else that we post. If you're watching online, go ahead and share this broadcast. If you're watching on your television screen, go ahead and call someone, tell them the show is on. Don't get blessed alone. Today, we are talking about the rights of widows. Very many stories have been heard out there of misfortune that has fallen people who have, lost their spouse, and in particular, because it's a woman show, widows. And you'll find very many people when, you've lost your husband and your in-laws are there, and quite a few things can go wrong if you do not have the right legal education, civic education about that. So today we have on set with us a lawyer. Her name is Harriet. Karibu sana.
Asante.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And she is going to educate us. Okay, so I'm going to guide her through this show to educate us, and so we can learn about what are the rights of widows, what is right, what is wrong, what can you do to help your situation. So like I said, Karibu, that is your camera right there. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us what you do and who you are.
Okay. I'm Harriet Nyambura Chege. I'm a lawyer by profession and training, and by practice, I'm also a civil society advocate with Wakili Mashinani, of which I'm a co-founder and practitioner alongside other co-founders who are legal practitioners as well as community development practitioners. And so at Wakili Mashinani, we offer legal aid. We also offer civic education and referral services to the needs of those who come in contact with us for purposes of obtaining legal aid.
Wow, that's really, really beautiful. And in regards to our topic today, rights of widows, have you handled such cases before, where you have a widow who's come to you, or you found a widow somewhere and they have not had the right, knowledge about this matter? Have you handled such cases?
Well, yes, indeed, because the idea of legal aid is to meet those who are the most vulnerable in society, who do not have the means to access their rights or ways of claiming their rights. And so among vulnerable groups include women, children, the youth, persons abled differently, and widows as well as widowers also fall within that category.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll get right into it. And I think the first question I'm going to ask you is, what rights do widows typically have after the death of their husband?
Well, as all women, widows have the right to be treated equally.
Yeah.
Equally to men, that means even to widowers, in the event of the death of their spouse. And in this regard, they have equal right to equal opportunities, be they political, economic, or social. And as regards the estate of their spouses, which is our context today, then they also have a right to be recognized by the law as dependents and beneficiaries of the estate of their late husbands. Yes.
Okay. Very many times, and depending also on culture, and we'll get into culture a little bit later on, very many times, when the husband passes away, the wife is kind of thrown out, depending on which culture you have, and everything goes to the family of the husband. So does the spouse or does the widow have the right to inherit the property of the spouse? And how do you go about that?
Okay. Well, in terms of culture, we recognize that Kenya is governed by the Constitution.
Yeah.
And the Constitution at Article 11, Sub-Article 1, refers to Kenya having the foundation of culture as a people and as a nation. So our Constitution recognizes that our cultures, our different cultures, shall be the foundation of our nation and as a people. But then under Article 28, it speaks of human dignity. And that says that every person is entitled to be treated in a dignified manner. That is with respect and with regard to their rights.
Yeah.
And that includes the promotion of those rights as well as protection. But specifically then to culture, like you say, the experience of some of the cultures is that women find themselves at a loss.
Yes.
And under Article 27 of the Constitution, again, sub-Article 3, is that every person is entitled to be treated in spite of their culture or cultural background with regard to the rule of law. And that therefore requires that the non-discriminate nature of the law should apply to every culture.
Yeah.
That means that culture should be subject in as far as the culture is repugnant. That means it does not, it's not coordinated. It doesn't amplify the rights of this person.
Yeah.
Then that culture is said to be repugnant to justice.
Yes.
And therefore, whether or not one person is coming from a different culture to the other, they're supposed to be treated equally before the law. And that is to have, like you suggest, the right to own property. And perhaps as we go along, we shall see that the caveat to that is, for instance, if the person that is deceased died having written a will and therefore willing his property to certain persons or organizations, or they died without having written a will. So that will also affect to what extent that the spouse will be able to inherit their property.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later. But before we go on, in Kenya, okay, let me get into something you've just said, that culture is subjected to the Constitution, and I really like that because like I told you before we started this show, I'm kind of a lawyer by education, and so I remember a place in the Constitution, I can't remember exactly where, that it says any other law that is goes against the Constitution, and I'm paraphrasing, is null and void, or something like that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
yes,
yes. That to the extent that your culture does not promote the right to equality, the right to life even, because you've had instances where people will affect even the right to life of a widow. For instance, we have cultures that speak to wife inheritance, and that also speaks to whether that person wants to be inherited or not, because then they have the right of choice, the freedom of choice rather. And so in as far as this person's right are being affected, then the law to look to is the law that is the constitution of this person, for as long as they're Kenyan and they're within the Kenyan borders. Because even within our borders, we have aliens. Sometimes we even have stateless persons who are living as refugees in Kenya. And so the constitution binds all state organs and all public bodies and all persons to adhere to what the constitution says and not adhere to what the culture says.
Wow, and I think that's very important for you to start kind of knowing what the Constitution says about you, about your situation, not just widows, but just across the board, so that you know what kind of rights you have and what to do about, when your right is infringed. Before we go on, we are talking about widows. These are people who have been married and have been left by their husband. In Kenya, we have different kind of marriages. There's the come we stay. Does that count as what we are talking about, a widow? If I had a come stay husband, we don't necessarily have any legal documents concerning our marriage, but he dies. Does that apply to me?
Well, first we would look to the definition of marriage. So we have the Marriage Act of 2014 in Kenya. And that act defines marriages at Section 6 to include the civil marriage. That is what we commonly say kwenda kwa DC, So it takes place at the
AG,
at the Attorney Generals, and then we have the Christian marriage, then we have the Hindu marriage, and then we have the Islamic marriage, and we have the African customary marriage. So the first three, that is the civil and the Hindu marriage and the Christian marriage, are monogamous marriages. While the Islamic and the African customary are potentially polygamous. So under each of those forms of marriages, then there has to be something that is done. Remember, marriage is a covenant. Whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian. And by covenant, I simply mean is a contract, it's an agreement. And for every agreement, we have to have witnesses to this agreement. We have to have even sometimes in the case of African customary and Islamic, you have to have dowry paid. as evidence, and ceremonies take place. Just like when you go to the Attorney General's office, there's a ceremony. You have whoever is coming to witness your marriage, whether it is the Attorney General officer and just yourselves and your friends. You also have a document that comes from there. And while in the African customary, you might not have a document, the law allows you to go and register that African customary marriage. So some people have been known to use affidavits. These affidavits are sworn before public officers such as the magistrates. They could also be sworn before an advocate. And this affidavit of marriage states that so and so, whom I'm living with them under African customary law, and they are my spouse. Yes, so it is very important. Even when you're in a situation of come we stay, that is what we call it in parlance, but it's actually cohabitation. When you're cohabiting with someone, that you go and reduce your cohabitation, even if in the form of an affidavit. And further to that, it's also important for you to speak openly with your spouse. If you're going to be cohabiting and you're choosing to be under the African customary, then you have to perform the African customary rites. Because what this process does is that it not only acknowledges you to the family of each other, and that is where you begin to get recognition. So that at the point where we are coming to a succession process, when you're able to swear an affidavit and say that you married this person in such a place and at such a time, it helps to explain your validity as a spouse. But as it is currently, if there is no document and there are no witnesses of the rites that are done under African customary, then you cannot claim to be married, no matter how long you live with someone. Yes.
Ms. Kia, if you had, make sure you have done this the right way, so that in case of succession, the right laws can apply to you. All right, I feel like that's security enough for anybody out there. That's awesome that we've shed light on that. Now, socially, we've talked about legally. Socially, are there any kind of security, social security that widows can have?
Well, socially speaking, in terms of their vulnerability.
Yes.
So if they're vulnerable, and by vulnerability, let us look to the indigence of the person. That means their financial well-being. Because widows are not one size fits all. There's a widow who may be able to afford to instruct an advocate to be able to carry through the succession process. There's a widow who might not have financial means. And so depending on the vulnerability, then you would have a social protection, because social protection is based on your vulnerability. So we have under the State Department and the Children's Social Services, Ministry of Social Services, there's the Orphans and Vulnerable Children. So sometimes where vulnerability of a widow, we are speaking to even her ability to bring up the children whom she has had with the deceased. So you could say to that extent that those children are covered as vulnerable children. We also have bursaries, which are available through the various constitutional development offices. But in terms of widows to be provided for under a law or under policy, we do not have. And the reason for this, I feel, is my view, is because for you to be vulnerable as a woman, it's not only death that can make you vulnerable. There are very many women, per se, who are in marriages and are living widows. You know, they have no right to the property. They have no right to even exercise their own gifts and talents to go out and work.
That's true.
So you could have women who are not vulnerable, not because of their widowhood, but because of other reasons. For instance, even ignorance can be a vulnerability. You could just lack information. For instance, your spouse has died. No one has ever died in your family. You don't know what next steps to take. You don't know what to do with the identity card. How do you process the death certificate? How do you get the notification so that you go and go to the chief and get a burial permit? So sometimes you become vulnerable because of ignorance. You may have the money. You may have money in your M-Pesa, in your bank account, but you don't know. You don't have information the next best.
Wow. We're going to take a short break, but we'll come back with this conversation. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.